Are in for a real treat. I'm so excited to host this debate because I think, especially covering higher ed, it's pretty rare right now to actually have an ideological debate about these things. And I certainly think that as conservatives, we benefit when we understand the other side's perspective and when we're not shooting down straw men on this. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for today, if I can find my spot in my notebook. So we have with us Steve Moore. He is a trusted advisor to President Trump at the Heritage Foundation, former colleague at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And we have Bhaskar Sunkara, editor of the Jacobin, and the author of a book on socialism. And I'm not finding my notes, so you're going to have to tell me what the title is.
The Socialist Manifesto.
Excellent. So the format for today, we're going to have them each make opening statements and then do a rebuttal to each other. I'm going to ask a couple questions. We're going to take questions from you in the audience. So as you're listening, write down what you want to have answered, pass it up to me. We'll get some of those in, and then we'll do a closing statement. So without further ado, let's have Steve Moore kick it off.
Well, thank you, Jillian. And by the way, Jillian just got back from, you were in Hong Kong, right?
I was.
You know, my first proposal is how about we give the Nobel Peace Prize to those freedom fighters in Hong Kong? Wouldn't that be an awesome thing? Second of all, I just want to do a shout out to Jennifer and Rick. I mean, awesome conference again. I was here for the ground. When was that? About how many years has this been? 50. Yeah. So it's amazing how this is. Don't they put on an amazing conference? So let's give them a great hand. And thank you for bringing me out. I think I've done this 4 or 5 times. I've always had a great time, and it's nice to look out. Who knew there were so many deplorable people here in Colorado? So, all right. So let's see. What am I going to say? I'm distressed by the fact that in the land of the free, the United States, the greatest country on earth, that latest polls show that over half of college graduates today view socialism as superior to free enterprise capitalism. And that is distressing for a lot of reasons, right? I mean, one of which is it tells you a lot about the very sad state of our education system, right? The fact that, we spend $200,000, $300,000 to educate our kids, and it's a huge, public investment in educating kids. And they come out with this dingbat idea that socialism is superior to capitalism. I was fortunate enough to be friends with Milton Friedman, maybe the greatest economist of the last 100 years, probably. And Milton used to say that what is the enduring lesson of the last century? I think it's pretty clear to anyone who knows history that socialism, communism, Maoism, Stalinism, Bernie Sandersism, whatever you want to call this stuff, is a failure, right? It's been a failure. It's repressed citizens. It's caused people to be poor, and that free market capitalism is a success. I mean, right? Isn't that the most important lesson of what happened in the 20th century? And yet now we have kids, Jillian, who actually think we need more socialism. And so we need to do something. And by the way, I would say I think most people in this room are conservative. And by the way, thank you for coming to a group that might not necessarily agree with all of your ideas. But we have got to take back our schools. If we allow the left to run our schools, we're going to get kids who don't understand the way the world works. Quickly, my point would be, I don't have a clicker, but I just brought a few slides, and Jillian, tell me when my 8 minutes is up, and I'll stop. But
we'll actually do 8 minutes and 30 seconds. We'll give you a buffer zone.
How much do I have left?
8 minutes and 30
I've already
seconds.
used 8 minutes?
Right.
Okay, I'll just show 2 things,
You're
and
at
then
2
I'll
and
stop.
a half.
But I don't have a clicker, so can you? Okay. So, first of all, we've done a lot of research at Heritage and when I was at Cato, and it shows pretty clearly there's a linear relationship, near linear relationship between the more free you are as a country, and by economic freedom we mean, I think you all know what economic freedom is. It's lower tax rates, it's less government spending, it's less regulation, it's property rights, it's the rule of contract and sound money, privatization. And you can see that, what you're looking at here is these charts that show, lo and behold, what this is showing is actually a positive thing, which is that the world has become more free over the last, 15, 20 years, and that's a good thing. And as freedom has emerged, you've seen a big reduction in global poverty. And I would make the case the single greatest achievement maybe in human history is what's happened in the last 25 years in terms of, through free market capitalism or at least the movement towards free market capitalism in places like India and China. We've moved 1 billion people out of abject poverty. That's a great improvement in such a short time. The next chart just shows, that economic freedom is associated with not just with more better economic performance, but free countries have better environmental improvement. Countries that are rich spend more on protecting the environment. The next one just shows you that, can you show the next chart? That social progress, things like health and other dynamics that not just economic, but social progress, education and things of that nature, infant mortality are highly associated with economic freedom. The next chart just shows you that, not only are countries that are free richer, a lot richer, they have higher life expectancy, better health outcomes. So social progress and economic progress are highly associated with economic freedom. And finally, and I'll just end with this, let's just talk about the states. This is, I think, one of our most powerful arguments for free enterprise, lower taxes, less regulation, is what's happening. I mean, you've heard me talk about this before. The big story of what's happening in America today is the high tax, more socialistic blue states are just getting clobbered by the red states. And you can see this in terms of just the 4 biggest states in the country, Texas and Florida, which have no income tax and have right to work laws and less regulation, are literally stealing the assets of the red states like California and New York, which are losing their people. So I would stop by simply saying I think that the evidence is pretty crystal clear that free enterprise is the solution to our problems, and we need to really think about how we can persuade voters that this is the right solution.
All right, great. You clocked in at 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
I did?
I'll give you some bonus time
you
later.
can use my extra time then.
All right, we'll kick it off here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for our host for the invitation and their willingness to engage a democratic socialist in debate. Both the best of classical liberalism and the best of democratic socialism share common roots in the Enlightenment tradition. And in an era of growing authoritarianism and narrow-mindedness, I'm glad to see the Steamboat Institute embrace the spirit of free inquiry. In the following, I'll try to briefly outline a definition of what capitalism is, a definition of what democratic socialism is, and what democratic socialists have accomplished as a political tradition so far. So obviously, I'll have to speak very quickly. I might need that 8 minutes and 30 seconds.
A couple more.
So socialists do not see capitalism as an entirely or even mostly negative historical phenomenon. And crucially, we emphasize that capitalism isn't merely a market system or a free market or free enterprise system. We've been using markets for millennia, and I believe they would serve an important, a crucial role in a future democratic social system as well. So what is capitalism and what are its origins? Simply, capitalism is a society characterized by wage labor and market dependence. I say that in a pejorative way. You don't necessarily have to think so, but that's the definition I'll be operating from. Before capitalism, feudalism was a dominant system across much of the world. Under it, people were divided between the majority who worked the land to survive and the small minority who appropriated the minority's labor through political coercion. Peasants had access to their own land, thus the means of their own survival. However, lords used force to extract a portion of their yield. This system didn't encourage innovation for the very obvious reason that peasants knew if they produced more for exchange, much of it would go to their lords. Feudalism faced periodic demographic crises, none more significant than the Black Death, which of course in Europe killed nearly half the population. As soon as the continent recovered, it was plunged into warfare and revolt. The end result of this warfare and revolt was that the ruling class reasserted its control in Eastern Europe, where peasants had their autonomy stripped even further through an extreme system of feudalism called serfdom, which bounded them to estates and criminalized flights. In France, by contrast, the peasants managed to secure de facto ownership of their lands, gave less of their yields to the lords. These weaker lords increasingly became functionaries of a centralized absolute estates. A middle ground prevailed in England. Peasants stopped their ruling class from extracting greater surplus from them through brute force, but they failed to win legal land rights. English lords, searching for new ways to produce surpluses beyond exploiting a depleted peasantry, laid the groundwork for a shift from a peasant proprietor system to one based on a tenant system. Tenants received leases and had incentives to be ever more productive, since they kept all their surplus after their rent was paid. Tenant farmers were compelled by the market to maximize production in a way peasants traditionally weren't. These farmers, in turn, began hiring landless peasants and others as wage laborers. This might sound like a small shift, but it was a profound transformation. This process created a highly productive agricultural sector able to sustain a large population not engaged in farming. It also meant that there was a majority without property that could be forced into wage labor. There had been markets before, indeed going back thousands of years, but early modern England was a first market society. It was the origin of capitalism. We know of the misery of industrial societies, but this development also set into motion advances in human productivity and in social wealth. And I would agree about your assessment in many ways the last 25 years on a world level, including Brazil, India, and China, that I would attribute a lot of that to a kind of state-managed liberalism as opposed to just free market, laissez-faire system. Now, democratic socialists don't want a year zero break with the present. Rather, we think that from this new condition of abundance, key aspects of capitalism, the coercion of wage labor, the persistence of abject poverty next to extreme abundance, and so on, can be done away with. So, what is democratic socialism in theory? Just as I wouldn't conflate, say, an American libertarian with the crimes of Pinochet, I should note that I'm not defending Stalinism or any other authoritarian tradition. Democratic socialists have long opposed such systems and have been their victims, in some cases their earliest victims. I'll focus my limited time on defending the worldview that I believe in, not in a caricature of it. Now, democratic socialists, at the very least, believe in the inalienability of personal, civil, and social rights, your right to speech, protest, and so on. The goal of socialism isn't thus to reject liberalism completely, but rather to ask deeper questions. For example, if freedom of press is a good thing, but we lived in a society without adequate public education to guarantee literacy, for instance, the right to freedom of press would be a right in name only. Thus, our opposition to capitalist democracy isn't due to the democratic rights it extends, but rather the ones it limits. Democratic socialists, in other words, believe profoundly in the importance of the individual and the idea that our individuality can only be developed in society embodying the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This would mean, at the very least, a society able to socially provide the bare necessities of life, food, housing, education, healthcare, and so on, to allow individual flourishing. Inspired by these ideas, democratic socialists in the United States have shaped the society we live in today, from the 8-hour work week to the struggles for women's suffrage, to full civil rights for Black Americans, and so on. Democratic socialists have been at the forefront of every small d movement for democracy in this country for the last 120 plus years. God rested on the 7th day. If you get the 6th day off, that's a product of a democratic socialist inspired and led labor movement. Indeed, the democracy that we have, the democracy we should respect and enhance, was foisted upon capitalists against our wishes by popular struggle. But what does democratic socialism in practice look like? Now, I think this is a difficult question because it's easy to compare a system that exists with all its contradictions and all its warts with a system that just merely exists theoretically. So I'll have to draw on some concrete examples. So let's think about democratic socialists in a party with Marxist roots and radical ambitions which governed a state nearly uninterruptedly for 40 years. I'm talking about Sweden, where the SAP, the Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, and this the Swedish SAP in its Swedish translation, governed nearly uninterrupted from the 1930s until 1976. They were able to create a society with public guarantees to healthcare, childcare, education, housing, and achieve better key social indicators than we have in the US today. To this day, in Europe's social democratic welfare states, the rights of business owners have been undermined through the regulation of capital. These societies, in other words, limit freedom for people to own private property, places that produce goods and services, not your car, your house, your toothbrush, to do what they will with their private property. But for the majority who don't, they enjoy a greater range of choice and a greater chance to fulfill their potential. They have this greater freedom, not because private property is upheld, because the freedom for the minority who own private property is limited. Fundamentally, socialists believe in the rights of working people to the fruits of their own labor. Of course, we believe in individual rights and individual freedom. Of course, there are certain spheres where the state should not enter. But our individuality can only be developed in society with a more robust set of democratic guarantees. It's obvious to any American that a person born in, say, Fairfield County, Connecticut, is probably going to have vastly different life outcomes than someone born in Flint, Michigan. So if the system isn't allowing people to reach their potential, if it's filled with amazing wealth, but also exploitation and poverty and all sorts of terrible misery, then how can we make it better? We try to tame the system at first. We try to build a welfare state to try to get the basics at least guaranteed as social rights. We advance with the democratic mandate through trial and error and try to construct a more just and participatory society like our predecessors in the Nordic states did. We accomplish what Sweden and other societies accomplished with mass movements inspired by democratic socialist ideas, a state that guarantees core social rights outside of the market. Then we push to transform unions from mere instruments of working class bargaining within capitalism into worker-owned cooperatives operating within a competitive marketplace. If democracy is a good thing when we vote every year in the ballot box, then why not have it in our workplaces as well? This last sphere, by the way, this emphasis
We're about a minute over.
Oh, this
And it's
emphasis
gonna come out of your, response.
on worker ownership and not merely the regulation and the shaping of capitalist outcomes, is the difference between democratic socialism and social democracy. So in summation, to conclude, it's my profound belief that future generations will look upon capitalism, the system we have today, as a time when life outcomes were accidents of birth, with shock and disgust, much the same way we look upon other more extreme forms of exploitation and oppression that we have already done away with shock and disgust. There is no fixed destinies for nations, but democratic socialism is, I believe, a horizon that we should move toward.
Great. So before we continue with the rebuttal, I did want to come back to you. You've got a little bit extra time, and I wanted to make sure we're really clear that we're talking about the same definitions. So I got a pretty concise definition of what socialism is from him, but what does socialism mean to you?
Socialism?
Yes.
It means more government control of the economy. And, I think the problem that I have, you made a lot of excellent points. The problem I have with this kind of argument that, we just want to move, from free enterprise more in this direction, but we don't want Stalinism, we don't want Maoism, we want, somewhere in this kind of middle ground. And so, the idea is like, well, not that kind of socialism. And my idea is like, that's like saying, you're sort of saying we want the good kind of socialism, like the Nordic countries. And my attitude is it's like saying we want the good venereal disease, not the bad venereal disease. I mean, the more you move towards towards a socialist direction, the more you're giving up your freedom. And I loved what you talked about the rights of individuals. And the Bill of Rights, which is one of the most important documents ever written, which obviously is part of our Constitution, is all about safeguarding those very kinds of rights that you're talking about by limiting government, right? That's what our Bill of Rights is. It's what our founders were worried about was that government would invade these basic fundamental rights that you talked about. I wanted to make one other point. Can you put up those charts again? Because there's one other chart I want to put up. And while you're doing that, I'll just simply say that a lot of people who want more government control of the economy, socialism, democratic socialism. Can you move towards the last one? Keep going. This one, go back. So, people say, you mentioned education, you mentioned healthcare. Obviously, we want people to have the highest quality of healthcare possible. And I actually believe in this rich country that we have, Jillian, we can afford to provide everyone who's a citizen, very high quality healthcare. I think we should assure that people have that. And you mentioned education, absolutely. And part of having a democratic capitalist system is you need a well-informed electorate that can make good decisions. And I showed you this because, it's so interesting to me. This is just showing the rate of inflation, the rate of cost increases across all sorts of industries. When they do the consumer price index, that is made up of thousands and thousands of products and hundreds of industries. And so, some industries obviously have faster rates of inflation than others. And what's so interesting about this chart, this is looking at price increases over roughly the last 20 years. And you can see the things that are traded in the free enterprise system. And this is one of the reasons free trade is important, is because when you get competition and private enterprise, look at what's happened to most consumer items. Everything from cars to apparel to furniture to toys to computers to software. These are not, for the most part, regulated by government, and their prices, they become more affordable to people. People can afford more of them. And then look at the left side of the chart, and you can see the two industries in America where prices are completely out of control. And, surprise, surprise, education and healthcare. Now, my question to you all is, what do those two industries have in common? Government, right? These are the two, you mentioned public education. When I asked my liberal friends, why do we have the government play such a big role in healthcare and education? And you know what they say? To make it more affordable. They're doing a great job of it, right? I mean, the two industries we have runaway costs are the ones that have become the least affordable. And I would say that, I'll just close by saying this, Jillian, then turn it back over. I think the biggest disgrace in this country is our public education system. I really do. I think we are robbing people who grow up in Newark, in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Michigan, Ohio, in Detroit, in Washington. I'm from Chicago. I've gone to the public schools in the inner cities there. Not one of you in this room would ever send your kids to those schools. They are incredibly depressing places to go. They're more like prisons than schools. I now live in Washington, D.C. It's the same kind of thing. Why do we tolerate that? We should give every single American child a voucher to go to any school they want to.
So you've got, I'll put the clock
I'll do
here.
like 3 minutes.
Okay, great.
Well, first of all, I agree that we should avoid the no true Scotsman fallacy. That's the worst part of almost any debate when you're talking about something like this.
What is that fallacy?
So for example, if I'm talking to a libertarian and I'm sharing discontent with the way society is run, they'll be agree with me, and they say, well, the problem is, society isn't capitalist enough. In the same way, when you're talking with certain socialists about the Soviet Union, about these other systems, they say, well, that's not real socialism. What I'm saying is real socialism. Suffice to say, there are forms of capitalism that have veered towards ugly authoritarianism. There's been forms of socialism that veered towards ugly authoritarianism. Neither of us defend those systems. It's a constant political battle to maintain and safeguard our civil rights in any political system, no matter who's in charge, a left or right. But let's talk about the distinct tradition of state power from the tradition I come out of, which is the democratic socialist tradition, which in countries across Europe have not only played the vital role achieving political democracy in the latter years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, but have in fact governed for decades with the peaceful transference of power. So after they ruled from the mid-1930s to 1976, what happened when the SAP lost an election to the Swedish conservatives? They left power peacefully, and they regained power about 6 years later. Now, these countries, though, in the span of that, let's say, 30, 40 years of social democratic rule, progressively made inroads on the rights of capital through growing regulation, and particularly through the power of sectoral bargaining. So I don't have time to get into it, but actually the power of sectoral bargaining led by the labor movement, not necessarily by the state, but by the labor movement, in fact, was the driving force regulating and making inroads against the power of private property. Individual rights were not trampled. So I think this is the key distinction and a key point of disagreement between us two, which is I believe that personal freedom can be upheld while still making inroads over certain private property rights, whereas you believe that they are intrinsically linked. Now, in these societies with higher wage economies, with more militant demands from the workers' movements, you actually had, what do you have when you have higher wage demands? You have pushes towards capital-intensive technology. You actually have, at times, greater rate of firm failure. But this firm failure actually meant that these were more dynamic and more competitive economies. And yes, in the case of the Nordic countries, they were economies very much driven around free trade. Tariffs and trade is not necessarily a left or a right issue. I think there are
As Donald Trump has shown.
no, and I think there are certain times when
Right.
protecting and sheltering a key strategic industry might actually be useful to have a tariff from time to time. I think there are other times when it's useful to expose those industries to competitive pressures. So I guess the final thing I'll say is that when it comes to the education system, in the United States, we have historically had a very weird mix of private and public insurance, and we've had kind of the worst of both worlds. In other countries, there are, in fact, more cost-effective and efficient means of public health insurance, for instance. There are many spheres where even people on the right would agree are natural monopolies, where it makes sense to have the state serve as an actor. I believe that healthcare is one of those spheres. In other spheres, I believe we still want the impetus of competition and innovation, and indeed firm failure, but we could do that instead with worker-owned and controlled firms. So the real question is, what is so particular about the rights of private capitalists as individual capitalists that you want to defend? Because if the argument isn't necessarily just about markets, but it's about private ownership, then you need to make a case for private ownership as opposed to unleashing the full potential of every working person in America by giving them a proper stake in the place where they spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week.
So could I say something quickly about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm sure, Jillian, you read my piece in the Wall Street Journal
Yes.
about this 3 weeks ago. I mean, there's an obvious solution. I could not agree more. We need to have every single American worker own a piece of the rock. We need to do that. We need to make sure every worker in America becomes a worker owner. And there is such a simple way to do that that would lead to middle-class people having ownership of the companies they work for and retiring at a much, much higher rate of retirement benefits than under Social Security. And that is simply let every single American, you can look this up, was 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Journal, we talked about an Own America plan. And that would be to allow every single young worker, anyone under the age of 35, put 10% of their paycheck, rather than sending it to the black hole of Social Security in Washington, they put that into an individual account that it owns, it's an index fund that owns every single stock in America. And what we found is, by the way, when you ask, I'm not necessarily you, but when I've done this debate with others, oh, look at Social Security, what a wonderful program it is. Social Security is the biggest ripoff for young people ever. We found that the average young person, I think you'll probably subscribe to this idea because you talked about worker capitalism. That would mean every single American would own companies. They would own, GE, they would own FedEx, they would own Google, they would own Apple. And we found, by the way, that the average middle-class American would retire with more than $1 million in their account because of the power of compound interest of putting money into this account for 40 years. And they would be able to have a benefit that would be 2 to 3 times higher than Social Security. And they would be able to leave $1 million to their heirs. So how about that idea?
Well, I think ownership also implies control. So I think you'll find ownership implies control in that I think you'll find, like the Swedish Social Democrats found in the 1970s when they pursued a wage earner fund, that eventually capital will reject that plan once it reaches the point where people are taking their ownership power and actually turning that into democratic control. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a thing that, in fact, that proposal sounds like a good starting point to me. It sounds like something I would potentially support, but it's something that a lot of the powerful interests that keep American capitalism going would reject if, in fact,
actually,
it was tied to forms of
It's actually
control.
the liberal Democrats who don't want that plan, not the Republicans. I mean, Trump is interested in that idea. Paul Ryan was interested in it. Got shot down by liberal Democrats who don't want Americans to own a piece of the rock. They want them to be subservient to the Social Security system. And this is sort of the problem that I have with the idea that the problem with, in my opinion, of like what you've laid out, is you have this vision like politicians are angels, right? And if they were angels, but they're not angels. I've lived in Washington for 35 years. These are not good people, for the most part. And they have their own interests at stake. And that's why I always tell people, young people, why would you want all of the government's going to give you this for free and that for free? The most important thing we have in America, you have to treasure it. You have to safeguard it. You have to, millions of Americans have lost their life to keep it, which is your freedom and liberty. Don't give it to these politicians in Washington. Fight for it. And what you're saying is we should have these people actually give up more of their liberty, give more of their, more of the decision making to politicians. And I just don't think that model works out so well for the people that you and I both want to help.
Well, I want to flesh this idea out a little bit more, because I think what we're talking about when we're talking about these systems, capitalism or socialism, is how do we have a system that best checks some of the worst impulses of human nature, whether that's greed or oppression or the tendency toward exploitation. So, Bhaskar, I'd like you to explain a little bit how you feel like your alternative would address those problems more effectively than capitalism would.
Well, I think the starting point is you start with reality and you start with systems that I think have worked. Now, I've seen the successes of welfare states in Europe. I've also seen the way in which these welfare states, which were extremely successful in the exceptional period of the post-war boom, also ran into certain roadblocks and problems, including kind of declines in firm profitability in the late 60s and 1970s. Now, there's different ways to approach this problem. So you could say that the problem was born out of excessive regulations, overly strong unions, and so forth. And in fact, the history of the last 20, 30 years has been a history of capital being unburdened by those things and finding new ways to innovate and create wealth. Or you can say, like those of us say on the left, that in fact this showed kind of a structural contradiction or a limit of social democracy, which is it placed more and more power in the hands of working people, but it ultimately left kind of the structures of society in the hands of capitalists. So a capitalist could say, well, this bargain was working for me in the 50s and 60s. I'm a Swedish capitalist, and I like the fact that there was less strikes in Sweden than there was in France. So yes, I'm taxed a little bit more. Yes, there's a little bit more regulations, but for the price of industrial peace, for the price of kind of having stable outcomes, I'm willing to give this up. But what happens when things start to get tighter and the international environment changes and there's more international composition and there's things like the OPEC shock and you're not as profitable as you were before? Well, then at that point, you have the ability to say, well, we're going to withhold investment. And that's a way that capital exerts its power in society. Because we all have one vote as individual kind of people, but we have different economic power and weight. So they're able to exert this undemocratic blackmail. I think that a solution of going from social democracy, a system that works, and we should admit that it works even if we think that it doesn't work as well as a different system. So, for example, if I'm proposing a social democratic system, you're proposing a system based on more market competition, maybe your system in your mind yields 5% GDP growth and mine yields 3.2. But this isn't the gulags and breadlines here. We're talking about the difference. So we go from what works and we figure out ways to take this blackmail and this extra power away from capital. Why? Because we think that there's a different system that better aligns the needs of working class people with kind of this broader structure of society. And because we think that at a moral and ethical level, that wage labor, the condition of being forced to work with someone, is in fact a contract signed under duress, and in fact is a form of exploitation we find unacceptable. And that's merely a moral and ethical distinction. So if we start from that moral and ethical starting point, then we figure out how to alleviate exploitation in ways that doesn't create new forms of oppression. But this is a constant struggle, and this is politics. Edmund Burke says, and I don't often quote Burke, but it's a line that I think is quite apt, that the only thing worse than existing tyranny is a failed revolution to upturn that tyranny. And I think that's something that socialists should keep in mind. But we have had decades of experience tinkering and experience in state power that hasn't yielded these kind of disastrous outcomes, and at worst have yielded, let's say, the slow-moving disaster of 5% versus 3.2% GDP growth.
Now, I wanted to ask you to, so when I'm talking to my friends on the far left, one of their big critiques is they feel that the capitalist system in the United States is rigged against them, that it's not really a free market, that it's big businesses exercising their political power, hiring expensive lobbyists and lawyers, using a licensing regime to block people out of business. So what would you do to reform that? Is that even possible within our current system, or is it too far gone?
Well, we don't have free market capitalism in America. I mean, we probably have more free market capitalism than most countries, and it's the reason everybody in the world wants to come here, even people from, from the Nordic countries. But The fact is that, there are, you make a good point, that what tends to happen is when corporations get a lot of power, you know this, you write about Jillian, what is the first thing they do? They run to Washington for protection. This is why, we want to divorce politics from business. I think you make some very good points about the power of some of these big companies, but the best way of regulating that power, in my opinion, is through competition. Letting, people, compete with these big powers, and oftentimes, you knock them off their perch, and that's a good thing, and I think that I've seen Washington, I've seen this so many times. I've been in the swamp for 20, 35 years. Business, you get an alliance between big government and big business that is extremely unhealthy and is not free market capitalism. So I'm for competition, I'm for small businesses, I'm for a lot of things you're saying that you're for. I just think the way to do it is to let people be free and not to run the government to make these decisions for us.
So I'm going to have you guys start passing up your questions, but while we do that, I have one more question for you. I'm actually about halfway through your book, really enjoying it, but I thought one of the most interesting statements you said was the equation of socialism with Stalinism, a common rhetorical tactic among centrists and conservatives, is wrong, and not only outside of Russia. And I did want to give you a chance to address that, because I think it's difficult historically to dissect or to draw a distinction between socialism and the places where it's gone horribly awry, not just Russia, but when we're talking about China, when we're talking about some of the places in Latin America where it's gone really poorly. So can you explain for me what's gone wrong with the socialist project in those places and how that differs from what you're proposing?
Well, I think fundamentally a lot of the failures that you saw, let's say in the Soviet Union, resulted from a few sources. One was the initial extreme underdevelopment of Russia, a country ravaged by World War, Civil War, and just generally at a very low level of development. And it was compounded by a shift towards forced collectivization, which was based on kind of misunderstandings of agriculture, and also on a very kind of inept form of central planning. This combined with the lack of an existing free civil society, the lack of existing political democratic freedoms, led to a country where you could say that during the first 20, 30 years of the Soviet Union, you had extreme political repression, but there was a degree of catch-up. But then eventually you had a system which was, as some people put it, kind of all kind of thumbs and no fingers. So it was able and actually capable of doing certain things like mass vaccinations or certain kind of rote processes like that, but are unable to kind of innovate and stay competitive. And of course, the fact that there was shortages that were then kind of forced to go through a political bureaucracy meant that certain decisions were kind of politicized, and which furthered kind of enhancing the role of essentially bureaucracy. So whereas what I object to in capitalism is the unaccountable rule of private capitalists, in the Soviet Union what you had was the unaccountable rule of bureaucrats. I think in other places...
What do you mean by, what do you mean by unaccountable? Like a company, are you saying a company is unaccountable? What is that? In a capitalist system, you said unaccountable.
So let's say if I'm working for you, if I'm the average worker in the United States, I don't have a union. I don't have access to, I have very limited access compared to other countries. So when we're talking about freedom, if you're also for expanding freedom for private enterprise, you should be for expanding freedom for workers to join unions as easily as they can in other countries. In the United States, we even have the outlawing of the solidarity strike, which means if I'm a worker at a hotel down the street and this hotel's on strike, I can't go on strike just for solidarity, all sorts of other things like that. So I think I'm primarily talking about at the point of production, the way in which most of our workplaces are run. I think we can have a system in which we still have a division of labor, we still have set tasks and differential wages even, but where average workers can elect their management to terms, in which we could subject more decision-making to collective processes. So just like in the Soviet Union or China, when there's a famine, when there's something like that, without a free civil society, news of the famine cannot spread, right? What happens in Wells Fargo's and these other big companies when there's malfeasances and disasters that almost imploded our whole economy 12 years ago? These things could have been stopped with the more democratic, transparent companies. And I think we do this by fostering forms of worker ownership that American corporations would find fundamentally unacceptable, along with the politicians in America.
So do you think that, look, I don't have a problem with unions. If people want to join a union, I think I believe in the right of, one of our basic First Amendment rights is the right of association. So if workers want to assemble and collectively bargain with their employer, I have no problem with that whatsoever. What I have a big problem is forcing every worker in that company to join the union. So do you think, are you against right to work laws? Because what we were finding, I mean, when I showed you the blue states for the red states, the states with forced unionism are only creating about half as many jobs as the states that don't have forced unionism.
In the context of the United States today, right to work laws serve to undermine and enfeeble a labor movement that's already been under assault by capital. But I would say that in other countries, in most countries of the world, which have much larger and more powerful labor movements, there's, in fact, certain things that exist in U.S. labor doesn't really exist in other countries, like, for example, automatic dues deductions and things like that. And in other countries, you can, in fact, be covered by a agreement and choose to opt out. In fact, very few workers choose to opt out because their unions are more engaged, and in fact, they feel more a part of their
But in the
union.
United States, you'd be in favor of forcing workers to join a union, even if they don't want to.
I think that in certain, I think that the act of a shop unionizing shouldn't be a one-time plebiscite in either ways. I think the union mandate should have to be continually renewed. So in other words, I think you could say that as individuals, you might not want people to be able to opt out because of certain problems of the free rider problems and so on, but that workers should have the chance to advocate with other workers for decertification. So make it easier to unionize like you can in other countries with card check and other things, but sure, make it easier to decertify too.
All right, great. With that, I'm going to switch over to some of the audience questions. And I'll begin with one for Steve. Someone's asking what you think about income inequality. Is that something that is inherently indesirable, or is it the sign of a healthy
Well,
society?
a couple things about this. We don't want to focus, I think the focus on income inequality is wrong. I mean, it's not the right problem to focus on. The fact that we have Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and we've got people like LeBron James and people who make millions and billions of dollars, that's not a problem. I mean, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Fred Smith at FedEx, they've built great companies. They achieved the American dream. What's wrong with that? They've employed tens, hundreds of thousands of people. Bernie Marcus, people like that are awesome, and they just, they give back to their communities. Their being rich does not make you and I poor. I mean, it's additive. That's what we love about the free enterprise system. I had a conversation with Bernie just a few weeks ago, and he's saying, look, yeah, I've become rich, but how did I become rich? I became rich by giving people things that they wanted. Nobody ever put a gun to anybody's head and said you have to go to Home Depot, right? It just turned out that he had this incredible, entrepreneurial idea that made everybody better off. And so I think our focus should be how do we raise the living standards of the people at the bottom? Because the American dream is to get rich, so we don't want people not to get rich in the country. And if you were to ask me the 2 or 3 most important things to do to achieve, better economic outcomes for people at the bottom, by far the single most important thing that we have to, talk about every single day is free market services. I'll say it again. Every single child in America, whether black, white, Hispanic, Asian, green, yellow, whatever their economic background, they should all have the opportunity to go to good school. And why do we tolerate that millions of kids go to these horrible government schools that are run, I hate to say this, but who are those schools run by? What I believe has become one of the most evil institutions in America, which is the teachers' unions. They advocate for themselves and not for the kids.
Would you care to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think by every independent measure, what is the most effective country in terms of education system in the world? It's Finland. And Finland's education minister is literally a Marxist. She might actually be a little bit a step to my left. Public schools can be done very well. I grew up and was a beneficiary of a public school system. It was regressively funded by property taxes, but it was a system that functioned quite well. There are millions of Americans who have access to very good public schools. There are other Americans who don't. I think part of the reasons why certain schools are underperforming has to do with the wider context of poverty. and neglect that people are growing up in. It's very difficult to perform well in schools if you're going to school hungry. I think the problem with our schools is, in fact, we need a more consistent system of federal funding and federal standards for our schools, and not this retreat to voucherization, which potentially is just the retreat into really small systems of petty fiefdoms and hierarchies where certain people have access to better goods than others. I think education is one thing that should be universal and should be equal.
Oh, I think it should be universal. I just think it's not fair that, you know, I got to go to a great high school and these low-income blacks and minorities go to these crappy high schools that are horrible. And by the way, it's not, look, some of it is clearly their family backgrounds and stuff, no question about that. You know, kids that grow up in fatherless homes, we know they have severe disadvantages, which is, by the way, the welfare state is probably the other reason we have so much severe poverty in America. It has created poverty, it hasn't alleviated poverty. But I would say this, we have great evidence that when you take many of those same kids, I've worked with a lot of those kids in Washington, D.C., who we've given vouchers to go to Catholic schools, Jewish schools, private schools, and they do very well. You know, their performance, you know, I remember one of the kids who I got to know very well, who had one of these, he said, and by the way, the only program in 8 years that Barack Obama wanted to get rid of was a voucher program for low-income people in Washington, D.C. And I remember one of the black parents said to me, Jillian, he said, you know, why does Barack Obama, you know, want to get rid of this program? You know, his kids go to Sidwell Friends, the best, you know, one of the best schools in the country. And they said, why shouldn't my kids be able to go to that school? And the guy was very funny. He said, and by the way, Barack Obama lives in public housing too, you know? So, I mean, we should give everybody an opportunity to go. Why should only rich people be able to go to Sidwell Friends School?
Well, I think any child should be able to go to schools the same opportunity. I agree with you. The culture of poverty myth is largely a myth, because when you put people in other contexts, well, I think primarily, think about I brought the example of Finland up before. Okay. Finland is a country that completely bans private education. So I don't care if you're a Catholic, if you're a Muslim, whatever, if you're a Jew, you know, teach your kid religion, you know, after 4 p.m. when they're home. And that would be the system that I'd be in favor of.
Wait,
quality,
hold on. You're in favor
universal,
of banning private schools?
I'd be in favor of high quality public education. Yeah. And I believe that there's a sphere for religion, and that sphere is in civil society and private life. But just like I'm not in favor of madrasas overseas, I'm not in favor of Catholic schools in the United States.
All right, so on that, I'm getting quite a few questions for you about if we're trying to collectivize or if we're trying to increase public ownership or worker ownership of businesses, private industry. What would that look like, and what would happen to the people that resist this? I know in your book you were talking about the example of a pasta shop, a pasta bottling company for the sauce. And I guess, like, how does this play out when it's obviously a politically divisive issue, and you wouldn't have the people that are business owners necessarily getting on board with it? What is your policy on the use of force?
Well, there's winners and losers in any transformation, but winners and losers need to be carried out by democratic means, and with means that respect certain of people's inalienable rights. So, for example, whether you like it or not, I imagine almost everyone in the room wouldn't like it. I would say there is a possibility that within the next 10, 15 years in this country, about 15+% of our GDP, the private health insurance industry, could be socialized and turned into Medicare for all. Now, that's a large chunk of the economy, and that's a big shift. Now, if you work at one of these companies, you should be worried about your job and the transition. That's why at least Bernie Sanders' healthcare plan, which I think out of the Democratic candidates is by far at least the most serious in taking these issues head on, has a clause about just transition for kind of the workers in those sectors as well. Now, if you're a private health insurance CEO or owner, your life might go from being spectacularly wealthy to just being middle class like the rest of us. And the idea is that there are a few losers in this process, but the losers aren't sinking to, that they're not kind of being thrown in prison. These losers are instead just knocked down a few pegs to the level of everyone else, but there's far more winners. There's winners among uninsured people. There's winners among millions of people who are dying of preventable diseases over the course of the decades, or just in general have a lower life expectancy than our peers in Europe and in other advanced industrial countries.
So,
I just got to address this issue of healthcare because I think it's a mythology that number one, yeah, we have big problems in the way we pay for healthcare. But ladies and gentlemen, we have by far the best healthcare system and medical care system in the world. Far none. I mean, no country even comes close. And we know this, Jillian, because kings and political leaders from all over the world, when they get sick, what do? Where do they come? They come to the United States for care. And by the way, I've had firsthand knowledge. I mean, the quality of care in the United States, with some exceptions, is exceptional. And the way we deal with diseases, whether cancer, heart disease, so on. The other point is, look, if you look at the last 80 blockbuster drugs that have come on the market that have dealt with all sorts of, horrible, crippling diseases and sometimes fatal diseases, like 60 of them have been developed here in the United States of America. Now, how is it that these other socialist countries have low costs? And the answer to that is very simple. They free ride. They free ride on our system. So if we went to a socialized system, the problem is who's going to develop the next generation of, the drugs and vaccines to deal with, MS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's, all these things. You're going to, and I just think there's, even on Medicare. Yeah, Medicare costs are lower, and you guys at the Journal have done some great editorials on this. It is true Medicare costs are lower per patient than people in the private system. You know why? Because there's a cost shift. Medicare shifts the costs onto the private insurance market. Now that means, so you're not going to save money by putting everybody in the Medicare system, right? Because now, who are you going to shift the extra costs to? The costs are going to go up, not down. Yes, we have a lot of problems with our healthcare system, and it is true, that our healthcare costs are rising at a dramatic level, but I would say it's because of too much government, not too little.
So one last question before we wrap this up.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask it to you, and then I'm going to ask a different variation of the question to
Yeah.
you. But when I read on the left, there seems to be, especially within people that have an affinity toward Marxism, a divide. People who think that it's purely about economic disparity, and then people who think it's about gender and race and many of these other ways that it plays out in the system. What is your opinion about that? Where do you stand on that debate? And what is your solution to greater equity?
Well, obviously, as a socialist, I oppose oppressions of all types. I think it's very obvious, though, that if you're talking about, let's say, the conditions of let's say, Black Americans in this country, and you're talking about giving these people more economic power, more rights, you're talking about redistributing power from large corporations, from others, redistributing wealth and through various programs, and that involves class. I think it's very obvious to me that class is the underlying thing that conditions a lot of our life. I think it's obvious to even most people in this room, I would imagine, that a lot of your life outcomes are determined by how much cash you have in your pocket. I think there are deeper struggles against oppression that we'll need to fight over many years. But I think class is the most important underlying thing. And beyond that, it's a galvanizing glue that can unite people across this country. And I think you can't build a political coalition if you're going to say that 35% of the country, roughly, it's white males, are all the enemy. That seems like a surefire way to ensure some sort of Republican majority. There's a quote from Bell Hooks, and it goes something like, of course, you say you want women to be equal to men, but men aren't equal to men. And I think the democratic socialist ideal is a society in which we all band together and unite and move forward, and not just argue over who has it worse or better off. And I think that's the kind of majoritarian politics that's represented by Bernie Sanders and by others who could actually win a majority in this country and not just further kind of divide up the electoral map.
And I guess my variation on that question to you would be, for better or for worse, the discussion on the left right now is about inequity, and specifically about how inequity affects people from different racial or gender groups. So what is the capitalist answer to that problem? How do you defend it, and how do you bring people back on board on the right?
Well, as I said, I mean, the government has, my friend Walter Williams, who's, written a great book about the state, it's called The State Against Blacks, and if anybody of you want a great answer to your question, they should read that book. That all sorts of government, policies where did slavery come from? Slavery wasn't a private sector. Slavery came from government. Where did the Jim Crow laws come from? They come from government. As Walter Williams would say, that probably the single worst thing that ever happened to the black family, he would say, the black family survived slavery, it survived Jim Crow laws, all sorts of discrimination laws. The one thing the black family could not survive was the welfare state. And the welfare state has probably been the single biggest detriment to black advancement in this country. And you just don't want to replace fathers with the state, and that's what we did. I'll just say one last point. And by the way, this has been a great debate, and I really appreciate your comments. I learned a lot from them. He did a great job, didn't he? I mean, that was really good. Which is that, there's an old saying. I wrote a book about 10 years ago called It's Getting Better All the Time. And it's just basically the history of the last 100 years. And what you find, and just if you want to get that book, it's just a picture book. You can look at the statistics. I mean, what's happened in terms of health, environmental improvement, not just economic advance for people at the top, Jillian, but the big story of the last 100 years has been the economic advancement of people at the bottom. There's an old saying, if you have to be poor, the United States is a pretty good place to be poor. The average person who's poor in the United States has a living standard that's significantly higher than the average living standard of middle-class people in most countries. And yes, we have to do a much better job of dealing with the people least among us. And I think that's something you and I share. But I just think freedom and free market capitalism are the way to do it. And one of the things that strikes me when I give talks on college campuses and I try to persuade people about the benefits of free market capitalism, some of the kids agree with it and some don't. But what's so striking is how many of the kids who come up to me after I'm done speaking, you may have had the same experience, and they say they don't, and these, these are the immigrants who came into this country from other countries. And they say, I don't understand my colleagues. Why do they want to socialize medicine, socialize this? Why do they want socialized education? All these. They say, I came to this country to get away from those policies. So let's not chase the losers. Let's do it the right way.
All right, we've got about 2 minutes left, but I'd love to give you the chance to give your closing thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, I guess one interesting thing about sometimes these debates that I have on the right, and I do appreciate the debate, and I appreciate the invitation, is that that often people with more libertarian inclinations are kind of the opinion that they've been losers in this kind of battle, that the U.S. has a large welfare state, that it has all these onerous regulations and things like that, and the last kind of decades since the New Deal at least have been a tale of kind of free market enterprise running against the barriers of this welfare state. For those of us on the left, particularly the socialist left, we think about the last 100+ years of American history as a history of an underdeveloped welfare state, which isn't universal, which actually has lots of inefficiencies, in part because we means test and do other things we don't do in other countries. We think about the fact that instead of having one party rooted in the labor movement or working class like they do in other countries, and another party rooted in kind of industrialists or a Christian Democratic Party and so on, we have what some socialists have called kind of the most enthusiastic capitalist party on the planet and the second most enthusiastic capitalist party on the planet. So I mean, I think that's one interesting thing. For me, the solution to a lot of our problems, but not all our problems as a society, involves guaranteeing a bedrock of social rights, which can be done efficiently through the use of a universal state that is still governed by certain norms and rules and so on. This wouldn't be a guaranteed outcome of either efficiency or a better life for people, but I think it could be a starting point. Now, beyond that, past the sphere of the commanding heights of the economy, certain things which I think government can do well, there's other sectors in which we actually want more competition, where we need things like firm failure to keep us going. The question is twofold. One is, what should the price of this failure be? If you're a worker at a firm that is moving into a new sector and you fail and your innovation fails, then what should happen to you? I think you should bounce on this net of the welfare state, be retrained through active labor market policies, and go to some other sector. I think this is in many ways why The systems that you saw in Nordic countries and elsewhere were more effective and efficient, even from the standpoint of economic efficiency in the 60s and 70s, because it allowed for this firm failure in innovation. And part of the pressure pushing us in this direction was strong unions, near universal unionization, and high wage demands. American capitalists and big corporations, to much extent, can afford to be lazy, because they have a they have low-wage, complacent workers, without rights, without guarantees that are pushing them to be more dynamic. So what I would say fundamentally is that we can have a society in which we secure a bedrock of social rights, and we can tie this to worker ownership in the sphere of production. And worker ownership means not just shareholding, but in fact means being able to elect your board. It means taking home not just a fixed salary, but dividends. And I think this is the kind of society we want. This is a true ownership society, but it means asking questions about the nature of freedom and the nature of democracy that libertarians simply do not want to ask.
All right, well, we're gonna unfortunately have to leave it at that, but I wanna give huge thanks to you guys for staying and listening, and great thanks to both of my panelists for this important discussion.